Starting off with chapter 1, a simplified body plan and homeostasis. And in this first packet, we're pretty much laying the foundation for the rest of the course, this semester and next semester. We're kind of talking about homeostasis, which is a really big theme in anatomy and physiology and structure and function. And we're also going to talk about a simplified view of how the body looks, how the various body compartments communicate with each other, and how that plays into homeostasis as well. All right. Before we get into it, let's start with a teaser question. And so I've got a multiple choice question here on the screen, and I'm going to launch a poll so that you can, oops. Oh, why didn't my poll launch? Okay, hang on a second. Let's see why this did not. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so let me share my screen again so you can see that, that question. Okay, so we're starting off with a bit of a teaser question. And the question is, what is the most abundant substance in the body? And I'll give you guys a minute to poll in, and then we will discuss. Okay, in the final 9 or 8 seconds here. Okay. So I don't think you guys can see the response, but I'll kind of look at the trend here. So most people selected B, and B is the correct answer. So the most abundant substance in the body is indeed water. Okay, our body's made up of about 60 to 70%, depending on what source you're looking at, of water. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today, the various water compartments and how they have to communicate in order to bring about and maintain homeostasis. Okay. So our first objective is to describe the distribution of water in the body and define different body fluid compartments. So although our bodies are made of 70% water, about, those compartments are not just all mushed together. They're not all communicating continuously, but they're separated by several different fluid compartments for very important reasons. So on this slide, what we're seeing is a very minimalist schematic representation of the human body, okay? And we say that it's minimalist because it's not an accurate representation of how we look. It's not the right shape, the proportions are obviously off, but what it does give us is those different compartments that I was talking about and how they differ relative to each other. So we can see very distinctively, we've got the internal environment here in yellow. And then in this lighter color, purple, we got the external environment. But then we can also see that within the internal environment, we have some different compartments as well. We've got blood vessels, we've got cells, we've got the lungs, we've got the GI tract, right, the gut, we've got the urinary tract. So these different water compartments are separate, and we can see how they kind of relate to each other, but how they communicate to each other as well. So let's look a little bit closer at the internal environment. This is the immediate environment of our cells, okay? This includes the lungs, the, again, heart, blood vessels, the urinary system, all of our nerves and muscles, etc. All of this makes up our internal environment. It includes the tissue fluid, so the water that is around our cells, we call that tissue fluid or interstitial fluid, as well as plasma. Plasma is the watery component of blood, and so plasma is going to be found within our blood vessels. So all of this makes up our internal body environment, and we can distinguish that from the external environment. This is anything that comes in contact to the outside, right? Think about the air that's sitting in your lungs. It's coming in direct contact with the external environment. The food, the nutrients, water, ions that are sitting in your gut, those are coming in contact. Although they're inside your body, they're still coming in contact with the external environment, as well as the urine in your urinary tract. Again, although it's within the urinary tract that's inside your body, it is still considered a part of the external environment. Okay, and we also want to point out the type of tissue that is found at the junction between the internal environment and the external environment. We call that type of tissue epithelia. So the lining tissue that separates the internal and external environment is called an epithelial lining. We find that lining the lungs, the alveoli of the lungs. We'll look at that when we get to the lungs. We find that lining the GI tract from the oral cavity all the way down to the colon. We also find that lining the urinary tract, right, from the kidneys all the way out to the external orifice here. So the separation between internal environment and external environment is called epithelia. And the external environment is anything that comes in contact with the outside world or the external environment. Okay. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, there must be exchange or communication that happens between these two environments, right? Although they're separated, they don't permanently remain sort of disattached or disjointed from each other. But the reason we have to have communication is for things like nutrients and oxygen and CO2 to diffuse across these membranes, and for waste products to diffuse in the opposite way, right? So oxygen needs to come in, CO2 needs to go out. And so the exchange between our cells, our tissue fluid, our plasma, and our external environment is also an important part of maintaining homeostasis so that we can get what we need and we can get rid of the waste products that are byproducts of our metabolic processes. Okay, such as CO2 and nitrogen. So let's look at the location of these barriers, these epithelial linings that separate internal and external. Again, we talked about them being in the lungs, right? Separating the alveoli from the capillaries that are around the lungs. We mentioned that they are in the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, or the gut from the oral cavity all the way through. And then in the kidneys as well, we have that epithelium. Let's look at the mechanisms for exchange. So in order to exchange nutrients, oxygen, CO2, there are certain processes that are involved. In the GI tract, it's absorption and secretion. Absorption is the movement of nutrients, water, ions across the epithelia from the external to the internal environment. Secretion is going to happen in the GI tract as well. That is the movement of water, mucus from the internal environment into the external environment so that that can be eliminated from the body as waste. Okay, and think about urine, think about, GI waste products as some of those secretory products. Mucus as well, which helps to lubricate the GI tract. So absorption is going in one direction and secretion is going in the opposite direction from internal to external. In the kidneys, we have a third process and we have a little bit of a difference in absorption. So because the kidneys act as a filter, they filter our plasma, pretty much take our blood, filter it through the glomerulus. We'll talk about these structures in the kidney unit. When we have our filtrate sitting in the kidneys, That's the first process, filtration. So filtering the blood plasma across the glomerulus, and it's now sitting in the kidneys. The second process of movement across these linings is reabsorption. And reabsorption differs from absorption in that we're now taking those substances back into the plasma after we have filtered them from the plasma to begin with. So the re here is implying that these substances were once already in the plasma. They were filtered out as a part of that first process, and then now they're being reclaimed or reabsorbed by the plasma because they're important. Things like amino acids, things like water, proteins that are needed by the body that we don't want to eliminate in the urine must be reclaimed or reabsorbed back into the blood. Okay, and then the final process here that we see in the kidneys is secretion, and that's simply movement of substances, particles in the opposite direction from the plasma into the blood. These would be things like toxins, like medications that the kidneys are clearing out. Drugs will be moved from the blood into the kidneys or the urinary tract rather, so that it can be eliminated as a part of the urine. So in the kidneys, we see a slight difference between absorption and reabsorption. And then we also see a third process, which is filtration. Okay. All right, let's look at the body divisions, the different fluid compartments that we were kind of speaking about earlier. So as I mentioned, the body is divided into these separate compartments. Each of these compartments having a different proportion of fluid, and they're separated by these epithelial membranes that we mentioned earlier. So the membranes must be semi-permeable because we talked about the importance of the communication of these compartments, right? The fact that the cells must communicate with the plasma must communicate with the interstitial fluid, and the interstitial fluid must communicate with the external environment. The membranes must be semi-permeable so that they can allow certain particles through and other particles not, right? And there are different properties that determine the semi-permeability. So they may allow certain particles by size, by charge, by shape, across these membranes, whereas other particles, again, because of their size or charge or shape, are not allowed through these membranes. That's what semi-permeable means. So some things can go through and other things will not. And then transport can happen between these compartments as is required. Now the importance here to maintain homeostasis, to maintain the relative proportions of these body compartments. So the first compartment is what we call total body water. So total body water is pretty straightforward. It's all the water and all the dissolved materials that are found within the body. So this is going to include inside the cells, around the tissues, and within the plasma, within the blood, within the vessels. And so we have total body water as the main, kind of the main container. And then within total body water, we have some other subdivisions or subcompartments. So the second compartments here that are inside total body water are the ICF and the ECF. ICF is going to be the intracellular fluid compartment. This is all the fluid that is inside our cells. So as we can see in the schematic on the left here, everything in blue is our ICF. So that everything that's inside of our cells, but we also want to look at the cells that are inside of our vessels. Okay, and don't confuse this with plasma. So because our blood is made up of cells, right? Erythrocytes or red blood cells, they also have fluid within them. So all the fluid that's inside of cells is called our intracellular fluid or our ICF. And then we can contrast that to the ECF, which is the extracellular fluid. And this is all the fluid that is outside the cells, but still inside the body. This is pretty much the internal environment that is divided into plasma. So the fluid that is inside our vessels, but around the erythrocytes. So not inside the erythrocytes or the red blood cells themselves, but that's around the erythrocytes, that's inside the vessel. We call that plasma. And then we've got the interstitial fluid, which is all the fluid that is around our tissues or around our cells. Remember, cells make up tissues, okay? So just to kind of recap that here, we've got total body water, and then we can divide that into what's inside cells, whether it be erythrocytes inside our vessels or other types of cells, muscle cells, liver cells, neurons. And then the second large compartment or subdivision is ECF, and that is everything that is outside cells, and that can be further broken down into what is surrounding our erythrocytes, what we call plasma inside of our vessels, and then what is around our tissues in general. We call that interstitial fluid, or we can call it tissue fluid. Okay. All right. Now, this table, I don't want you to memorize these values. What I really want is for you to understand the proportions here and kind of take a look or kind of understand the big picture in regard to the proportions. So what we can see is that total body water is about 42 liters. And then of total body water, most of that, about half of it, a little more than half of it, is actually inside our cells. So most of total body water is actually inside our cells. And then of the extracellular fluid, we can see that most of the ECF is actually around the tissues and very little of it is within the plasma. Okay, so I kind of repeat that here again. I don't want you to really memorize these values, but what I want you to understand is the trend that we can see with the proportions. So most of the water in our body resides within our cells, again, be it cells in our vessels, the erythrocytes, or cells within the rest of our body, right? GI cells, liver cells. And then of the extracellular fluid compartment, which is the smaller chunk, most of that water is actually around our tissues, and a very small amount of it is within our plasma, within the vessels. Alrighty. And just to remind you here, these proportions can change. This is for a standard healthy male, but obviously if someone is pregnant, if you're dehydrated, you can see different values and different proportions for some of these fluid compartments.